To today's session of the Education Select Committee, which is on children and social care, and we are taking all evidence from our first panel of Dr. Lucy Peake, the Chief Executive of Kinship, Emily Frith, the Chief Executive of Adoption UK, Sarah Thomas, the Chief Executive of the Fostering Network. You're all very welcome. We've heard already in this inquiry about some of the positive outcomes from fostering, adoption and kinship care. Compared to other forms of care and those longer-term outcomes. So I wonder if each of you, just as an opening point, could talk about the longer-term outcomes from the types of care that you represent. Perhaps start with Emily.
Thank you. What I'd say first of all is that it's really difficult to compare outcomes between different forms of permanence, and what's really important is getting the right decision for every child. However, adoption does have very positive outcomes for young people in terms of their educational attainment and that sort of longer term permanence and stability for young people for where it's the right decision for them. Also, the benefit is that adoptees often, most adoptees will have a continuing relationship with their parents in adulthood, and that provides that longer term stability. But what really matters is making sure that we get the right solution for each child. So that would be the overarching message.
Overarching snapshot there. Thank you. Sarah, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think I would flag to the committee that the children that we talk about are all the same children. The experience that they have once they are removed from their family is very much dependent on so many different factors as to where they end up, and whether they are placed in adoption, fostering or kinship. The outcomes are different, and the things that we shouldn't be seeing is such level of difference between the outcomes. When these young people become adults, they should have the same opportunities, they should have had a good life, because either way we as a country removed them from their families. So I would say that I think we need to really look at this, and we need to think about what is it that is producing good outcomes for children, and should we take it back to that at its core, what is best for these children and how can we assure that we achieve that? Because the decisions that are being made are clearly not necessarily resulting in good outcomes. When you look at fostering, when you look at children who are raised in our care system, they are not necessarily becoming the adults that we would want them to, and they do not necessarily have access to the things that we would want for our own children. And I think it is time for us to be thinking about these children as if they were our own children, and making informed decisions and providing the funding to local authorities so that they can think about these children as if they were their own.
And just on the issue, you mentioned obviously different outcomes. There's also within fostering there's a very wide range of different levels of permanence in terms of, and sometimes short placements are necessary and important. Is there anything further you just say in terms of the importance and the relevance of permanence within the fostering picture?
I think it's very, very important that our care planning process looks carefully at what is right for each child. So permanence, whether it be through adoption, kinship or fostering, should be that. Children should not be moved once they are placed in permanence. The matching process should be good enough. The sufficiency of the foster carers, the location of the foster carers and the access of the foster carers, which currently does not work in the sector as it stands, in the way that the fostering provision has grown from a local authority only provision to a much wider sector with a huge number of other opportunities for foster carers to be attracted to, and other companies and private provision. We need to think about how well that's working, and I don't talk about that in relation to profiteering or any of that. I mean genuinely in relation to where children are living, because the provision is no longer just in the local area. And then in relation to transition, I would say that we really need to think about how well we reunify children back to their families. And there is an area that could be hugely diversified in respect of fostering. We run a service called Step Up, Step Down, which is entirely where foster carers support children to return or remain with their families. And I think that is a key area for us to be looking at in this country.
Thank you. And Dr. Lucy, can I come to you in terms of the outcomes for children in kinship care? We heard some very positive things in some of our previous sessions. Obviously, again, you'll be dealing with a very wide range of different children in different circumstances and different arrangements. Can you talk to that a little bit in terms of what does the evidence show?
So, I mean, the evidence that we do have will indicate that kinship care is better for most children than foster or residential care. So that would be across employment, education and health. But within that, as you say, there are differences. And I think one of the reasons for that is some of the things that have been talked about already. So it's about that continuity of care, stability, prior relationship with a kinship carer, somebody who knew and loved you already, who steps up and says, I will care for you forever. So we don't have in kinship care the same cliff edge as we have for some children in the care system. And that means that that stability and that continuity does contribute towards those better outcomes. The thing just to add on what Sarah and Emily have already said is that it's really important to recognise that while we might talk about better outcomes within this small group of children, outcomes for children in kinship care are not as good as children in the general population. And we need to focus on that and think, what is it that we could do to improve support for our children, whether they are adopted, in foster care or residential care or kinship care, to encourage those better outcomes right across. So I think there are recognised lack of support issues that we need to focus on.
If I could just come in on that, I think Lucy's absolutely right, and I think we need to think about all children who are care experienced and how we can support them to have the best outcomes, no matter which route that they come through. Because while we're talking here about the positive outcomes that the kind of forms of care we provide can deliver, in comparison to their classmates and the general population, these children need additional support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's very much the purpose of this inquiry in general, is to look across the piece at that. And but I think it's useful to draw out the different arrangements and perhaps the different levels of support that they might need. I'll hand over to Flick.
Okay, this is mostly to Sarah, because in your submission, your evidence, it said that the most effective form of care for looked after children is fostering. And yet we hear that there's quite a lot of breakdown of fostering, and children get moved to different places. So I just wondered what your thoughts were, and possibly the other panellists too. But can I start with you, Sarah?
There is a national crisis in foster care, and I touched on this just a moment ago. The fact is that, in the last 25 years, we've transitioned from a place of local authorities recruiting foster carers to their local area, resulting in children always being placed, or primarily where it was in their best interest, being placed close to home, close to school, close to family connections. The ability to reunify to families was better. The ability for them to maintain many of the strengths that were part of their life was better. We are now in a position where children are moving hundreds of miles in order to find the most appropriate, and not always the most appropriate, it is just the foster placement that is available. There is a national crisis. So I think the key thing that we need to do is look at how we can build recruitment and retention for foster carers. I do not pretend to represent every single foster carer, but we do represent those that come to us and tell us the experiences that they are having, and primarily the support, the finances, and their ability to see fostering as a realistic alternative for them to provide their 100% of their time and care for children is no longer an option for many, many people. And it is a very small percentage of the population, a very small but special group of people will come forward to foster. And at the moment, the way that the sector is set up, there is too many people trying to fight for that small population of individuals that will come forward to foster. And I think that is what is key and needs to be addressed.
Too many organisations, you think?
Yes, I think so. And I think the fact that there is no oversight and transparency, so we don't have, for example, a register of foster carers in the same way we do for social workers and other parts of the sector. There is a register for care workers, there's a register for youth, there's a number of different registers, and that enables services to make sure that they can maintain quality, consistency, ensure learning and development remains of standard practice, give independence to foster carers, ensure that they feel respected and valued as part of that team around the child. And it would enable local authorities to be able to see where foster carers are and where services are, and make sure that availability of foster carers was transparent, so that they could make the best informed matches for children. Because I believe the stability issue is because we are not able to make effective matches for children. We're moving them out of their communities, we're putting them in temporary arrangements because we were unable to find what was right for them. And it is about being able to find the right foster carer at the right time, in the right place.
And there's a problem with keeping siblings together, I think, too.
Significant problem with keeping siblings together. I would say that we need to consider legislation around this in the same way that other countries have, because at the moment the challenge is, and we may not always be able to keep all sibling groups together, but I believe, I've been a social worker for over 20 years, and I believe that we were able to do that better in the past than we are doing currently. And I think it would be an important area to scrutinise in relation to children being placed out of their local area and siblings being separated and the long-term impact that that has on them. And if we can't keep them together in their fostering placement, we should be looking to services like our Keeping Together principles, the work of the family rights group, Lifelong Links, in order to make sure that those children do have a relationship as siblings, because we are effectively removing their support networks as adults. We turn to siblings, you turn to family. These young people are very isolated when they do leave the care system, and we need to have done everything we can to enable them to have the best supports possible around them when they reach adulthood and they are no longer within a system that should care for them.
Thank you. I'll bring in Nick and then, Vicky, do you want to come and briefly?
Really briefly, because you just made a really passionate request for this register. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that didn't happen when we just had the major review of children's social care?
I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't speak for
why
the decision makers.
Why would you not have it?
Why would you not? I can't see any reason why not. There are safeguarding issues around it. There are significant safeguarding issues connected to the register of foster carers. There's important evidence there in respect of foster carers feeling valued. And, you know, there was a review of fostering by Mark Owers many years ago, which clearly recommended that we needed a register of foster carers. And that is now being considered in Wales. And I would urge that we look at that in England as well.
Might need to have only certain people being able to see it for safeguarding.
There would definitely be restrictions on it. There would definitely need to be a number of measures, and it could be layered. There could be different layers to that, but something needs to change to enable local authorities to find the foster carers that they need.
Okay, I'll bring in Nick Fletcher. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you've touched on this a little bit already, but the biggest issue surrounding recruitment and retention, I'd like to address that issue, but just on what Vicky's just said there, if you put another layer in, like a register, would that deter foster parents from coming forward? I hear a lot of times with a lot of things is that there's so many barriers to actually helping, so many barriers to volunteering, so many barriers to doing things. People just, and I know the argument's always, well, if you really want to do it, then you do this. But I think sometimes you need to take barriers away to help, although I completely understand the need for a register. I'm quite surprised there isn't one. I mean, so yeah, there's a lot around there. If you can unpack that for us.
So in relation to the barriers, there is a significant barrier that would be removed if you had a register. Right now, when a foster carer decides, I no longer wish to foster with this service, I wish to foster with this alternative service, they have to go through the process from start. Our regulations require that they are separately and independently assessed by a separate agency. If we had a register that maintained their approval status and said, you've met the requirements on an annual basis to continue to foster, this is your approval status, this is what we know about you, and you have met all those requirements, they would be able to transfer with ease. They would have ownership of their fostering status, and they could go to an alternative service who could check the register and say, thank you very much, you maintain the requirements. We lose thousands of foster carers, more than we gain every single year, and many of those people tell us that that is because they were unable to continue fostering with that particular service. If a service is not being utilised in the way that it needs to be, and this is not necessarily local authorities, I don't think local authorities have got vacant placements of foster carers, but there might be some that do. They struggle to transfer and then be utilised, or if they're unhappy with their agency or service for one reason or another, they cannot transfer like a social worker or any other worker can. So I believe that it's really important that we have that register. I don't think it would be an additional layer. I actually think it would be an ease to the sector, and it would remove many of the barriers that exist.
Why have we had a drop in the number of foster carers then? Why is that? Do you know?
I think that is because, as I've said, there is a small pool of people that come forward to foster. They go through a process by which can be seen as very extensive, and it needs to be. It is rigorous for the right reasons. You are caring for vulnerable children in your home 24/7 with no oversight whatsoever of your day-to-day practice. So we must do a vigorous assessment and make sure that that is the right thing for children. But it is becoming less and less appealing. There are a number of people who are very vocal and explain, fostering, the key way to recruit foster carers is word of mouth. That has been the case for decades. We know that that's what works best. If foster carers are unhappy and they are unhappy in the way that they're receiving remuneration, support, the provision, the matching of children. It's just got to a point where people are no longer positive about the experience, or too few people are positive about the experience. And we need to turn that on its head by investing in recruitment, investing in retention, and ensuring that we have a strategy that ensures those things are fulfilled across England.
Can I just ask one more?
Yeah, of course.
I've actually got another question beside this one as well. You talked about siblings and about how it legislated to keep them together. I'm interested how you would actually legislate for that, because if I want to be a foster carer and I say I can only really cope with one child, then that's it. I can only cope with one. So how does the legislation part work on that?
So what it would do is place a duty. So what we don't have right now is a duty in the same way that we have for example, like contact with siblings. There's no duty in law that says that we need to ensure that they are placed together wherever possible. It is child-centred. We should be practicing a child-centred way, but because of the pressures on the system and the lack of provision, we're not always able to. And because we don't have full transparency of every fostering provision that's available, we can't always keep siblings together. And there could be foster carers around the corner that we need to access, but we can't, because there is no way of ensuring that our commissioning processes access all available foster carers. I believe if we brought in a duty, we would go some way to support that and to ensure that we placed a duty on those services to identify when there was available foster carers, so we could do better and take a step in the right direction.
You wouldn't be forcing fosterers to take these children, but you would be putting a duty out there so that any local authority should do all it can to keep these. But don't they do that already? Surely everyone would understand it's best to keep siblings together.
I think they absolutely try their very best, but they are working in a state where there are things that prevent them. There are barriers preventing them from accessing all available foster carers. So I believe that that duty would support that.
Okay. I've just got another question for you, actually, so I hope you don't mind. What can the government do to improve trauma-informed care in the foster system?
I think some of this again would go back to talking about the register. If we want to improve trauma-informed care, which we need to because these are some of our most traumatised children, and if we want to ensure that those that are caring for them are informed in the way that they practice, we need to think about providing consistent levels of learning and development. The only way that we can ensure our fostering workforce understands trauma and delivers trauma-informed parenting is to have an approach that says this is how we should go about it, and to ensure that the workforce is informed and that everybody is well informed in what it is that these children need in order to ensure that the approach is trauma informed. So I think that goes back again to the register. There could be minimum requirements, there could be standards and expectations. I think it is time to potentially look at the national minimum standards and the regulations that sit around fostering and look at where can we strengthen this from what we've learnt and what we know about what we need for our children. How can the regulations be strengthened to ensure that we deliver that for our children and young people?
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. I'll bring in Andrew.
Yes, thank you. So ask Sarah and then broaden it out though. How far do you think the government's children's social care strategy, stable, homes built on love, goes towards addressing the issues that you've already highlighted that are within the fostering system, and what more or different could be done about that?
I think that it goes some way to addressing them, and I think there are very important recommendations within the strategy, and I think that it's very important that it's been undertaken. I think the time now is to act. That there have been a number of reviews, there are a number of inquiries, there is a process by which we sort of go around continually asking questions and researching and learning, and I think what we need to do now is act. We need to implement the changes and we need to fund the changes properly. You know, the thing that has not happened yet is that funding that local authorities require to deliver on some of those changes and to ensure that they provide best practice for all the children and young people that need them. I think the key for me in relation to gaps are that real focus on where our children live in and what is their experience, because I'm not sure we've gone far enough, and I think that there are things that we need to do to ensure that we do have more requirements around children being placed local to their homes, reunification, a stronger evidence base for why and how and when we should reunify children back to their families, and also making sure that we have a much stronger process around matching and retention for foster carers. We need to build the fostering. For years and years now, the numbers of foster carers leaving is greater than that gate that join, and we've got to address that. That tide has got to turn in the next 12 months, or we will struggle to be able to provide fostering provision, and we will end up with more and more children being placed in residential or other unregulated provision that is not in their best interest. So I think that's what we should really focus on.
15 years ago now since I became a county council leader, and spent 4 years hearing exactly these issues being expressed then. So it's something of a dismaying spectacle to see all these things still being as difficult and challenging as ever, if not more. Any thoughts from Emily and Lucy on the government's report and what we need to do further?
In terms of fostering or more generally?
We'll move on to things.
So just to add to the conversation around the fostering, I'd say from our perspective, sometimes there are barriers put in the way of foster carers wanting to adopt a child, and I think that is unnecessary, and I think we completely agree with everything Sarah said. If we can boost the number of foster carers, then that would probably be less of a risk for local authorities. And on the point of siblings being together, I think absolutely that's something that we do want to see. It's not right for every child, so it has to be in a child's best interest, but more support for families, because often you'll end up with a sibling in kinship care, one in foster care and one in an adoptive family, and we need more support for all of these families to manage those really challenging situations where you're trying to bring children together. Our family days often will be a venue where two adopters might come together and bring siblings from from the same family together to meet, and providing those kind of supportive environments can help, because often adopted families are just left to deal with this themselves, and it can be really challenging for the child. So more support for that contact, I think, is absolutely vital.
Thank you.
I think from a fostering perspective, what I would like to say is that there is an overlap between kinship care and foster care. So about 10% of children in kinship care are in foster care. So for whatever reason, a decision has been made for that child to be in the care system and for their kinship carer to become a foster carer. In some ways that opens the doors to support. They are the most supported children and kinship carers. But what it sort of highlights is there is almost like a perverse incentive for some kinship carers to become foster carers. And I think what the Stable Homes Built on Love and the strategy gives us an opportunity to do is to think about how do we build a kinship care system that is right for kinship carers. So we pivot some of the support so it follows the children and it's not determined by legal order. I think that would make it better almost, because we can structure that foster care system that's right for foster carers who typically are not family members, but then build that kinship care system that's right for family and friends who've stepped in to raise the children. They do need different support, and I think some of the things that Sarah's outlining actually wouldn't be right for some kinship carers. They might not want to go on a register because actually they've stepped in to care for a particular child in a particular set of circumstances. So I think there is a really amazing opportunity actually to think about what does the children's social care system look like in the future? How do we build the kinship care system that's right for kinship care, but also get the fostering and the adoption parts right as well?
I wrote a paper for CPS about looked after children recently, and the role of charities such as Springboard and local authority placements for children in both state and independent boarding schools in terms of providing a wider opportunity for fosterers who may not be able to be 24/7 but want to provide that sort of background. Now, I accept it's not for everybody, and I make that point repeatedly in my paper, but I wonder if you do feel there is a role for that sort of placement to widen the fostering network.
Yeah, absolutely. For foster carers to support children, for them to remain within their families.
But a whole range to provide opportunity for kinship carers not to be as full on, but to be there for fosterers to have an opportunity to look after the interests of a child, but also not be 24/7, and just widen the pool.
I think that is an interesting area, and it is right for some people. I would say that foster carers should have their own support networks. You can't foster in isolation, just like you can't parent in isolation. You need support networks around you. And I think that when we have separate foster carers who provide traditional respite or that sort of provision, it can actually damage the relationships between that child and their foster carer. So I think that in some cases it might be of use, but I think we should be far stronger in promoting and ensuring and potentially regulating that every foster carer comes forward, is also approved with a support network around them, someone who can care for children alongside them, be there, have their back and support them as they go through that fostering journey, because we need to be looking at this from a child-centred perspective, and it is much better for a child to remain stable in their foster family without the use of unrelated and unknown foster carers coming forward to support them, because children see that as something that is a punishment to them. I have to go away this weekend to give my parent a break from me. So I think we have to be careful about how we use that. There are other settings in relation to like our step up, step down service where foster carers are matched with families and specifically provide respite, overnight breaks, sleepovers, lots of support to them, but the primary aim is to keep those children within their families. And that has seen a 95% success rate where it's been trialled so far, keeping children at home and reducing the numbers of children who become looked after. And I have to say that I would say that is the key thing. Prevention should be our focus. You know, the numbers of children becoming looked after is rocketing, and we need to do something about that. We need to ensure that actually we look back at where we can fund preventative services such as those that go hand in hand with families, because what we are not doing right now is supporting those families to care for their children. I talked about how when these are all the same children, they really are, and they really need us to be thinking more about what are we doing to keep them with their families before we start looking at what is the care order, where should they live for the rest of their life, what have we already done to make sure that we've strengthened everything we can to support that family to look after that child, because the majority of children who are looked after in England are going back to their families at the end of the day, and we haven't worked with them or done anything to support them, to enable them to prevent future generations of children becoming looked after.
In terms of broadening out the network, do you think that regional care cooperatives have any use, or are they just a bureaucratic distraction?
I think that is I don't think they're going to solve the problem, but I can see that there are some benefits. You know, certainly working on a regional basis can be supportive. I think one of the things that we are unfortunately in, due to the pressures on the system, we're in a place of competition. Local authorities compete with each other, IFAs compete with each other, everybody is competing because there is a shortage of provision. If we move to a position of collaboration and start working together, pooling resources, working together with our resources, we will definitely go some way to solving the problems that we face in providing the right provision for children. I think that there needs to be more work done in relation to the RCCs to explore exactly what problem will they solve. I think we really need to think strategically about who are the children and what difference will this make to them. Is it going to make the difference that we think, or is there an alternative way to ensure collaboration and regional working?
Thank you. I guess your point about collaboration, I think is interesting as well, because certainly in my experience, being in a part of the West Midlands that doesn't always feel like it's part of the West Midlands, we often look to Gloucestershire rather than our neighbours to the north, and yet they are in a different region. And so sometimes these regions can feel very artificial. And being able to look to work with all your neighbours is sometimes more important than perhaps doing things on a regional basis.
Absolutely. The neighbouring authorities and the way that they can work together needs to be strengthened and looked at. And it takes really strong leaders to think, actually, we won't be protective of our resources. We'll think about how are we working together? How can we collaborate? I think it's critical.
I bring in Mohammed.
Thank you. Emily, if I come to you first, we heard that adoption can be painful. Adopted children are more likely to be excluded from schools. They are more likely to have social, emotional and mental health issues, and they are more likely to leave the schools without any qualifications. How big this problem is?
Yes, absolutely. Adopted children have a really difficult start in life. Adoption is for those children who are unable to grow up safely with their birth family. 8 out of 10 adopted young people have had experienced neglect or abuse before they were adopted. So we're talking about children who've had a really, really challenging start, and then they're unable to grow up with their birth family. So all of those issues around identity. There's a myth, I think, out there in the wider world that adoption is a happy ending. Mm-hmm. And while adoption can be really permanent, stable solution for children, those families need our support throughout, and those young people need our support throughout their lives in order to combat some of those really challenging early situations. And so what we're calling for is a support plan in place for every child, which is reviewed, and particularly in the teenage years when a child reaches secondary school, to provide that support around the family so that families can help those young people deal with those challenges, and support within the education system. We need trauma-informed teaching. We need children to have an automatic right to an EHCP assessment. 8 out of 10 adopted young people have SEND. So it makes sense for them to have an automatic right to an assessment. And we need schools to understand the impact of early childhood trauma so that those children can have the ability to really reach their potential and have happy, worthwhile, lifelong futures.
We have the National Adoption Strategy. Is that working? And if not, what more the government can do to help to improve the emotional and educational outcomes of these children?
So some of the things we're really supportive of are the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. It is a lifeline for families, and families that have access it tell us in our barometer survey that it really makes a difference. I was speaking to a young person who's had access to this therapy and is now studying art at college, but she said without that therapy she wouldn't have been able to reach where she is today, and she still really struggles. She wasn't able to stay in mainstream school because she said it was like hell to her. She had a huge amount of issues, and that support fund really makes a difference. But there are issues with the way it's run. There's a bit of a cliff edge every year. We have to campaign for it every spending review. We need a permanent support fund and permanent access to that specialist support. There have been really positive changes in the adoption strategy around education, things like the access to the Pupil Premium Plus. But what we really need is a review of that to see, is it working and is the support getting to the families who need it? So yes, good progress, but more to do.
2023 saw the lowest rate for adoptions since 2000. Only 2,960 looked after children were adopted. What's the reason for that in your view?
Well, we would say there's no right number of children who should be adopted, and what really matters is the right solution for each child. But I do think that there are risks around the kind of wider system of support available. I think Sarah talked about word of mouth, and I think if we don't get the right support for families, then we may see fewer people coming forward, particularly in a cost of living crisis. We've seen that that's impacting the number of people coming forward to adopt. And what that means is children are waiting longer. We're seeing the average it can be 2 years and 5 months before a child finds the right family for them. And we're seeing those waiting times go up, and particularly for children in sibling groups, as we've talked about, children with additional needs. So we really need to make sure the right support is available so that families are able to come forward and support children. We are able to get those children adopted where it's the right plan for them.
Sarah, in your view, is the systems working now as it is, or the government should do to find some better alternatives for children in care?
I think we need to improve in a number of areas, and Emily talks about the adoptive families. Remember, children who are not adopted end up in long-term foster care. They are in our system until they turn 18. And then when they turn 18, we provide some level of provision, but it isn't properly funded. And we really need to look at how long should we care for the children that we have removed from their families and raised as our own. That is ultimately what we are doing as social workers and as social care services. And I think we really need to think about what would we want if these were our children, because at the age of 18, sometimes 16, children are finding themselves with no support network around them, no adult to care for them, no siblings in their life, and the outcomes are really, really concerning. We should be able to do better, and we should have our sights on what the futures are that we want for these children and young people. So I do believe that we really need to start thinking about them all as a group. We need to think about whether they've gone through adoption, whether they're in kinship, or whether they're in fostering. These children need alternative outcomes for them. They should be having better support from us across the board, and we should really have a focus on what is it that they need, and therefore what do we put into the system to meet those needs.
What is the rate of forced adoption when a child is taken away from the parents without their consent? What are the problems related to that?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it's an area of a bit of confusion at the moment. So nearly all adoptions nowadays are where it's really unsafe for a child to grow up with any member of their birth family, and that's why they're adopted. So it's something which is really unfortunate. I think we would say that where a child can be supported to stay in their birth family, that's absolutely right. But there will be some children where it's not safe, and then those children will get a permanent, stable solution through adoption. But then support needs to be provided, because even though they're not growing up in the care system, you know, the decision has been taken to place this child to be adopted. There's a responsibility on us as a society to support those children as they grow up. Forced adoption, historical forced adoption, is a term that refers to when in the 50s, 60s and 70s unmarried mothers were sort of coerced into giving up their babies. That was inhumane practice, and we as a charity have called for an apology from the government, as has been done in Wales, to say that practice was completely wrong. And we think that what that has shown is that anyone who's adopted needs support throughout their lives. So we've called for therapy where it's needed, and peer support for adult adoptees, particularly anyone who is an adopted adult, including those from the forced adoption era.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna.
Thank you, Chair. My question is also to you, Emily. Do you think that the government's intervention strategy, Stable Homes Built on Love, includes enough measures for the adoption system?
It was slightly unfortunate timing in that we had a national adoption strategy, and then quite quickly afterwards we had Stable Homes Built in Love, which again was slightly unfortunate timing coming towards the end of a parliament. So I think looking forward, what we need to see is think about the whole system, and in stable homes there are some measures that don't include adopted young people as care experienced, and we would like to see that wider definition of care experience, which includes anyone who is growing up outside of their birth parents. So that includes in the case of kinship, informal kinship care, but it also includes adopted young people, because as we've talked about a lot, these are children who really are not necessarily going to have the same outcomes as their peers without the right support in place. So we would like to see some of those measures included in stable homes to be extended to adopted children and young people, and a sort of more collaboration between the two strategies.
That's very helpful. What more do you think can be done to deal with the waiting times and to decrease them for children waiting to be adopted? It's very troubling to see that those waiting times have actually increased in the last few years.
Yes, and we are now starting to see a reduction in the number of adopters coming forward. I think that's absolutely the issue to think about is those children for whom adoption has been found to be the right support, why are they waiting longer? And it tends to be particular groups of young people. So we're looking at sibling groups, children with disabilities, older children, and black children particularly. So what we need to do is to make sure that recruitment strategies are targeting people who will come forward. We want to see a more diverse range of adopters coming forward, particularly black adopters who are able to adopt children with the same heritage and help them bring them up with their understanding of their heritage. So that's really important. But I think overall what's really important is to make sure that when a family comes forward to adopt, that they know they'll get the right support. So if their child has additional needs, unfortunately time and time again I talk to adopters who feel like the biggest challenge for them is fighting the system to get the support that their child needs, and that shouldn't be right. It shouldn't. One of the young people in our advisory group had 15 different homes before he was adopted at the age of 3. and his parents have had to fight for the right support for him in education. When he hit secondary school, he couldn't leave his room. You know, that trauma sort of caught up with him, and his parents were fighting to get the right support. He said, what I would have liked would be to just have a room in school where I could go to calm down, and not that to be confused with the idea of shutting me in a closet, which is what happened. We need a system that supports these young people through their families and in education, and unfortunately at the moment that's just not happening.
Back to your first point about we need to diversify and encourage more families from other ethnic groups to come forward. How do you think we can do that?
There's some really good work being done out there. There's a project in London called the Black Adoption Project, and the National Adoption Recruitment Steering Group is really looking at this. And I think there's things we can do across different sectors as well. There's really good work in kinship care from certain communities, and I think we need to think about this in foster care as well, because it's really important for a young person to understand their heritage and identity. So we need to make sure that the system is welcoming of all adopters, and that there aren't additional barriers in place for certain groups of adopters. I don't think we've got that right yet, and there's much more that could be done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Lucy, we're going to focus a little now on kinship care. You've already touched on some of the advantages earlier in the session. You talked about the prior relationship, of course, very, very important. You talked about the continuity. There aren't the same cliff edges. But in relation to some of the other issues that have been raised, is one of the advantages of kinship care, is it around geography? Are you more likely to be sort of closer then to other sort of family members and your schooling or sort of other sort of structures in life? Around siblings, is that another potential advantage? And of course, waiting times was previously mentioned. Some of the kinship carers in my own constituency say waiting time clearly wasn't an issue when they got the call at 2 a.m. and the social worker arrived with the child in those really distressing sort of situations. So some of the wider advantages, if you will.
So I think it's really important to recognise that kinship care is quite different from fostering and adoption. People don't put themselves forward, go on training, go through some form of matching process. It's often in response to a crisis. So they do get that call and they do step up at whatever time of day. I think you're right about geography. You are more likely to remain in the place where you're living. And I know of kinship carers who will drive quite a long way to make sure that the child goes to the same school, because they've experienced so much trauma of being separated from maybe mum that they think one bit of stability in life is really, really important. So they will actually spend every last penny they've got on driving to school. And I knew of a kinship carer who actually was so impoverished by that. She used to sit in her car all day while the child was at school. But that was so important. Siblings, I did want to come back on that. Kinship carers are far more likely to try and keep siblings together. What we are really concerned about, though, is in our last survey, the number of kinship carers who said they wanted to do that, but they weren't able to because of financial pressure, and also that constant fight for trying to get support for their children. So we know that sometimes siblings have been split up, babies have been adopted, older brothers and sisters are in the care system. Kinship carers are often playing that thing in their minds about maybe it would be better for my child to go a different route, because by going a different route, the child is eligible for different support. And that's the real issue within the system as it is structured at the moment. We should be making sure, whatever the decision, we're trying to keep siblings together. We're making sure that whoever the carer is, they are able to access the support they need. I think we would all talk about one of the biggest challenges being trying to get the support for the children, fighting constantly within a system that is not very well designed.
What are so that really touches on the sort of follow-up questions I wanted to ask around the main issues, which you've sort of touched on again, but those perverse incentives that you spoke about, where there is potentially a very different level of support, financial and otherwise, between the formal and the informal sort of kinship care sort of settings. Are you able to sort of speak any more to that and around the sort of guardianship orders as well in that process?
So we don't have great data about kinship care. So the census from 2021 tells us about 130,000 children in kinship care in England. So it's by far the biggest group of children. I think it's 3 times more than in mainstream foster care. Within that group, there will be, we think, 10% are in kinship foster care. So those kinship carers and their children will be eligible for all the same supports as any other child in the care system or foster carer. What we know about the other group is there is a growing number with a special guardianship order. So more children leave the care system now on a special guardianship order than an adoption order, and that's been happening for a few years now. But the data is not very well linked, so there's some Department for Education data and some MOJ data. As part of the strategy, the Department for Education is doing a data linking project to try and look more about who those children are and what decisions are being made about legal order and why. But if we roll back from that group, there is this much larger group of informal arrangements. So that's where family has stepped up and on their own and taken on the child, or perhaps because of circumstance, the way that they've stepped up has led to them being told that it's a private arrangement. So that could be a teacher makes a call, or a police officer makes a call, and the carer runs to that child as quickly as they can for all the reasons you describe, and they're told, well, social workers weren't involved, that's a private arrangement, why are you asking for any help? We have a huge group of kinship carers in that bracket. We think the majority are there. And the reason why that matters is that in kinship care, legal order determines access to support. So most people don't have a legal order which is going to give them the right to a financial allowance, the right to get their child a therapeutic support they need, additional educational support if they need it. And what we see, even where that they might have a special guardianship order, for example, it depends on whether the child has previously been in the looked after system. So it's a really complicated system to navigate.
Just on that, do you have any figures for what proportion of the children in kinship care have been in the looked after system? I presume it's a minority, but do you have any kind of more detailed breakdown?
I would say that the data is not good enough at the moment. So hopefully, I think the department's data project will be really important. They've acknowledged that one of the problems is we don't have good data. So we have good data about the group who are in the fostering system. We have some data about the group who have special guardianship orders, but that depends on whether they go through what's called a public or private law route, and those routes determine access to support. So it's quite a confused picture. What we would say, based on the families that we work with, most carers will say, if I hadn't stepped in, the child would have gone into care. So they are definitely diverting children from the care system, but there are also that group who are exiting the care system. And so I think the potential for kinship care is to look at, can we divert, but also for some children who are in the care system, can they move into another form of kinship care? So if we supported special guardianship better, could some of those children who are still in the fostering space, could they move into well-supported special guardianship? Because their carers have said, look, I'm going to care for this child till they're 18 and beyond. This is a permanent arrangement. So if it's better for the child to move there, why would we have a system that is holding those children in the care system? Because that's the only way we can access support for them.
Understood. Is there a tension, though, here? Because you described the motivation of kinship carers sort of moving forward, and it is of a different nature. They're not likely to want to subscribe to being on a register. You talked about sort of training. Where is there, or is there a tension between more formal recognition and sort of officialdom moving into that sort of very domestic scene, but also providing the very necessary support? Because my sense is, if we could better support kinship care, then that would be a very significant move on some of the recruitment issues that we have more widely in the system, because every child has a family, so there's a potential there, I sense, an untapped potential if we could better support families to support the children within.
So we go back to the points that were made by my colleagues. We have to make the best decisions for each child, and for some children it will be the right decision that they are adopted or they go into foster care. We think for the vast majority, it is right that they stay within their family, and that's what the Stable Homes is saying. Look, there's this untapped potential within family networks. And certainly within some local authorities where they are investing long-term in supporting kinship carers, we can see that their numbers of children in care are falling because they are saying long-term to their kinship carers, we will support you. If you need financial support, we are here for you. If your children need additional support as they grow up, it will be available. At the moment, I think there's a sort of legacy issue within kinship care that most kinship carers have struggled to get any support whatsoever. And as we move forward with the strategy, we need to rebuild the trust among families that if they do step forward and they take a special guardianship order or a different order because that's right for their child, they will still have access to the support. I think we talked about word of mouth earlier. There are many Facebook groups where kinship carers are advising each other to become foster carers. And you can understand why. But actually, I think your point about family, what's special about family is that it's not regulated. You don't have to keep records. You don't have to, get authority from social workers if the child wants to go on a sleepover. And I know that shouldn't always happen in fostering, but family it's different. What's different about kinship care is that it is family. It's what we'd want for most of our children. And we need to find the space that safeguards children appropriately, but gives those families access to the support that they and their children need.
And on a very last question, some of those kind of then supports, because you talked about economic circumstances, and it is very costly, and some kinship carers have had to give up employment altogether and sort of overnight. Presumably, some greater protections you would, though, look to see being made to recognise that role, even if kinship carers don't want to recognise themselves as that sort of formal kinship carer, which is often the case in carers. They describe themselves actually as husbands and wives or family rather than sort of that sort of carer role. But there are some moves, presumably, you'd like to see being formalised.
So financial hardship is it's a defining characteristic of kinship care. So the government's own strategy quotes the census 2021, 67% of children in kinship care are in a deprived household. Now, we would like to see the introduction of an allowance that is on par with that for fostering. Foster carers are given that allowance to cover the costs of raising someone else's child. We think that is the right thing to do for kinship carers as well. They have stepped in to raise someone else's child. The other thing that we're campaigning for is parity with adoption leave. So we have 8 in 10 kinship carers say they either give up work or they reduce their hours when they take on the child. So these are typically women. They are often leaving the labour market for the second time. They've raised their own children already. They are forced to turn to the benefit system. And I have carers ringing in my ears all the time about that who will say, I would not change that for the world. I did that because I wanted to do it, but I have impoverished myself today, for tomorrow, and forever. It is not just their income now that they're struggling around. It's that fear about their pension, the fear about living the rest of their life relying on the benefit system, when they had been people who were working, were saving, were doing everything that they were supposed to do. So I think the government needs to go further on both of those. They've introduced a pathfinder, so there'll be 8 local authorities where there would be pilots of allowances. Again, eligibility is an issue, so you have to be a special guardian and the child has to be previously looked after.
A very small subset.
Very, very small. And you can imagine if you're one of those kinship carers in one of those local authorities who's not eligible, or you're in the neighbouring local authority, you just live over the road, that's a really impossible situation. We have kinship carers contacting our advice service all the time where their primary issue will be money. They just don't have enough money. They're turning to food banks. They come to us wanting us to help them get grants for beds for their children. There is no parity, actually, across most kinship carers and fostering. And that's why you can see why there's this perverse incentive for some of our families to say, actually, to do this, I need to become a foster carer.
Thank you. You mentioned some local authorities supporting kinship carers better than others. Some good examples you can give the committee of local authorities that are sort of doing this most effectively.
So Leeds City Council for a long time has invested in family. So they have a view where they say, actually, what is it that this family needs to support this child? So it's a really empowering sort of message. And they have for a long time had a kinship care team. They have better financial support than most places. But there are also a lot of other local authorities that are starting to invest in kinship care. So we're working with Bromley, Nottinghamshire, for example, where they are commissioning our Kinship Connected programme, because they can see by bringing the voluntary sector into their transformation journey, they can build trust with the families, because we provide support, we develop peer support groups with them, we change the relationship between them and their kinship carers, so there is more of a trusting relationship. And that's all about, I think, for those local authorities saying kinship care's a key pillar. So it's like the national strategy saying, if we can keep more children in well-supported kinship care, that does reduce the pressure on foster care and on residential care. If we don't need social workers to be working with those children who've moved out of kinship foster care into special guardianship, then there's more social worker time to be doing other things where that's really needed. So I think increasingly local authorities are seeing that it makes sense to invest in well-supported kinship care.
Thank you. Vicky.
Thank you. So Lucy, what's good about the government's championing kinship care strategy?
Okay, so the first thing is it recognises kinship carers, and I think they deserve that recognition. They are caring for the most children. They're generally doing a phenomenal job despite not getting support. So it's been a really key message to them to say thank you. We see you and we want to improve support. The other thing it does, there's a good problem diagnosis there. So the government hasn't shied away from acknowledging some of the issues. So, they are quoting 67% of children in kinship care in a deprived household. And they are setting out a vision to say, despite all of those problems, we think more children can grow up in well-supported kinship care. The issue is that there's no investment that matches that ambition. So we are at the end of a spending review period, so we've got quite low investments, time-limited investment. They haven't grasped, I think, their own ambition and set out a clear long-term roadmap with long-term investment to realise that. So there is a danger right now that there is a shift towards placing more children into kinship care before that system has been developed, before that support exists. There is no comprehensive support system.
Come on to what else needs to happen in a minute, but I wanted to make sure we've got what's good on that. So looking at what other measures could happen, I want to talk about kinship leave. Somebody suggested it should be called a kinship break. That's absolutely raised every heckle down my back, having had 3 children. Maternity leave is not a break, and it's not a break if somebody else's child arrives in crisis in the middle of the night. Because I've had many kinship carers tell me that when they've taken the child in crisis, and it usually is, they've had to give up their job because they didn't have that legal right to take a break. What you mentioned, 8 out of 10. Is that across all kinship carers? Because I thought often kinship carers might have retired. How many would it help?
I think so. One thing we recognise is that women are working longer now. Mm-hmm. So if women are expected to work to 67, then actually most people who become kinship carers will still be working age. So there's been a shift. And although most kinship carers are grandparents, they will be 40s, 50s, 60s, so they can be all kinds of ages. And I think what happens for those who are giving up work, it affects them differently depending on their career stage. So if you're 22, you've just left university and you become a kinship carer for your siblings, you're not at that critical career building time. Whereas if you're in your 50s and you leave the labour market, you might be just leaving early and never returning. So I think it's important to recognise that it will affect kinship carers in different ways.
Would you suggest it needs to look very like the adoption leave rules, or the differences?
So we are calling for parity with adoption leave. That feels like the right thing to do. So because we have people who are picking up babies and being faced with the choice of either you take your 4 weeks leave and go back to work and the baby goes into some kind of daycare, or you leave your job, and most kinship carers are leaving their jobs.
Can I just add to that? I would say completely agree with everything that Lucy's saying, but one of the learnings from the adoption leave is that self-employed adopters were left out, so I would say absolutely we should make sure that kinship carers and adopters who are self-employed also get access to the leave in the same way that maternity leave.
And what's interesting, so we've got something called
should it only be for unexpected cases of kinship care? I think it should be for all.
So we would say, if you're taking on responsibility for looking after someone else's child, then you need time to bond with that child, settle them. As we've talked about a lot, all of these children have experienced some form of trauma. They've often experienced neglect, abuse, all kinds of things. They need to have time with their primary carer. Yeah. The other thing is just to acknowledge that I think there's often for people who are going through the court process, there are lots of meetings, there's lots of, representing yourself in court, preparing for that. It's a really tumultuous time for people. So even for those who try to remain in work, often they just say, I just can't do this anymore. It's not fair to my colleagues. I've explained it to my boss. So what we're doing, we've got a scheme called Kinship Friendly, which is about working with employers to say, what can you do to support your kinship carers? So some of that is really good information, because who might you tell when you become a kinship carer? Probably someone at work. So really clear information so they can get good advice, make informed choices, but also flexibility around leave. At the moment, some employers are doing that in different ways. So some have, like B&Q, have matched the adoption leave, which is amazing. Others, like John Lewis Partnership, have said, look, we can give a fixed time for people when they need it, and that might be different for different people. But actually, what most employers are saying is we need statutory paid leave for this group. They can see this group of families are in their workforce. They want to retain their good workers.
So having it statutory
would match.
Got it. I'm mindful of time. Do we need more clarity on international kinship carers? How big is that an issue? Your child was living overseas. It must be a growing issue. And then the grandchild.
I think for some local authorities it is an issue, and there is an organisation called CFAB who specialise in that issue. So it's not something that we specialise on. We're much more focused on supporting carers who live in England and Wales.
Are there any other things that you think we should be doing urgently as recommendations from this?
My recommendation would be to recognise that the kinship care support system doesn't exist. It's piecemeal, it's often, carers being put into different pots. So I'd say this is a brilliant opportunity to think about what does this group of unique families need, and to put those things in the right order. So at the moment, it's a piecemeal response through the strategy. I think we need to be thinking about what's the ecosystem that we require to support these families, what's the role of local authorities, the voluntary sector, peer support, what do we need those different actors to do in the future?
I'm sort of thinking aloud a bit here. I'm not necessarily convinced that children who are with a kinship carer, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, necessarily as a cohort need the same level of support as children who don't have any of those relatives to fall back on, and either in foster care or in children's homes. And so whilst I can see that, you're fighting for the support and how do I get the level of support, I can also think if I was a teacher or a social worker, I might want to focus on this cohort more. Now, there may be some that overlap within the two cohorts. So I'm guessing you're saying we need some support, more support than we get to children who don't have any who are still with their own families. but not necessarily all the same levels.
I think I'd see that back to how we framed this discussion at the beginning. It's about what does this individual child need. So every child has gone through different experiences. Irrespective of who their carer is, they might need support. And I think what we have is a system which is making those carers and those adoptive parents have to fight for that. Yeah. So actually, I think we need to take a child...
pupil premium or other things.
So I would say actually we should be equalising up for our children in kinship care. Some of them will need more, some will need less. And that's true of children in foster care or children who are adopted.
And there's both a moral and an economic case for this, because actually, if adopted young people are twice as likely as their peers to be neat, if we're wanting to meet our educational goals for the whole system, or if we're wanting to encourage every child to have that opportunity to thrive, then actually investing in the child and their family, whether it's kinship care or adopter, has to be economically make sense.
Or indeed reunification, which Sarah touched on, and I know we're going to come to in the next panel. I'm going to wrap up that panel there. Thank you very much for your evidence today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is currently suspended. The proceeding 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 is currently suspended.
Frontline, Professor Lucille Allen, co-chair of the Association of Professors of Social Work, and Matt Clayton, the Strategic Lead for Children in Care and Care Leavers at Coventry City Council. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the committee today. My first question, the government's 2023 Children's Social Care Strategy, Stable Homes Built on Love, aims to ensure a high-skilled social worker for every child that needs one. Does the strategy sufficiently meet the recruitment and retention needs of the sector? Can I go perhaps first to Professor Allen?
Hello, good morning. The strategy offers a number of very helpful approaches to the social workforce, and acknowledging there are a range of different routes into social work, so there's a mixed economy, but we're all on the same mission to work collaboratively to recruit good students who go on to be good social workers. However, data shows that there is a great deal of turnover within the social work, child and family sector, and social workers are leaving very quickly after being qualified, and more focus could be given to considering what additional support is needed for students, newly qualified social workers moving into employment. Although Stable Homes does refer to a new workload action group and the early career framework, which I think will strengthen things.
Okay, thank you. And that's something that this committee is very familiar with, the concept of early career framework from the work that we've been doing on teacher recruitment and retention. But of course, some of the same challenges persist in that space. Mary, can I bring you on this?
Sure. I completely agree. I think what we'd say at Frontline is it perhaps doesn't go far enough, certainly in the areas of culture and leadership. I think a lot of the challenges that we see day to day, both in developing social workers' practice, in encouraging them to innovate and in looking at leadership, is that culture and leadership sort of underpin a lot of the challenges in local authorities. So really welcome the early career framework and especially the opportunity to learn from the education, what has gone well and not so well in that space. But that's the first 5 years of people's careers, and actually who we're losing at times are those people who we most need, the ones with more experience. Excuse me. So I think what the opportunity is for those people through careers for both developing their practice and their leadership, so that they can be do the modelling and the mentoring of the more junior members of the team, but also as a pipeline for future leaders into the system. And I don't know, in the submission I think we referenced the fact that we were commissioned to deliver the Pathways programme, so we've trained 1,800 managers across the whole country of England in different levels of the social work system. And that was a 2-year project, excuse me, programme with a possible 2-year extension. But we found out last week that programme's not being extended. So that's a really great example of where we think that was very welcome by local authorities. It was very popular. It was trying to catch people at the first step of their career right through to just prior to director level. So more in that space would be what we're campaigning for.
And we might come back to that point about the rationale for non-extension. But Matt, as a practitioner, you're dealing with the consequences of these programmes. Where do you see this in terms of the recruitment and retention challenge and what the strategy does address versus perhaps what it might not?
Yeah, I think the strategy is really strong about recruitment. I think it's less strong on retention. I do think that actually the wider strategy does help retention, because ultimately I think a lot of social workers leave the profession because they're not able to practice in the way that they want to. I think what was shared about culture is really important about that. And actually, even listening to the previous session, actually social workers come into the profession because they want to help improve outcomes for children and families. They want to work to keep families together. They want to help to see young people in care go on to succeed. And I think actually sometimes they become quite demoralised by the system, quite demoralised by the culture, quite demoralised about the opportunities for children to have the right placements. We've seen in the news at the weekend some of the things around unregulated placements. As a social worker, that's really demoralising if you're not able to achieve the outcomes you want to, and I think that drives some people out of the profession. I think the Pathways programme is a good example of actually trying to build a good culture for children. I think, what I see is social workers staying when they feel that they can actually have manageable work caseloads and make the differences they want to. I think when they start to think, actually, I'm working my guts out and actually I'm not able to work against this system, I think that's when people leave. Ultimately, it's obviously money, pay, things come into that, but ultimately it's a vocation. So people want to stay in it when they can see that they're making a difference. And I think the overall strategy actually does help with that, because it focuses on some of the things that matter for children and families. Okay,
thank you. And then what are your views on the recently published National Framework for Children's Social Care and whether that goes far enough? Do you want to come on, Mary? Sure.
It's a baseline. The national framework is a fantastic kind of starting point, and in a lot of areas, in my opinion, that haven't had that clarity before. It's starting at a straightforward place, and presumably will be built on. But those 4 outcomes that very clearly state the absolutely fundamental baseline of what the expectation is of social workers and other people working with children and families to achieve those 4 outcomes. I think it's, as with so much of many of the proposals and the next steps, the ECF being one of them, is how it's implemented and at what pace and scale would be the things.
The implementation is really key.
100%.
Yeah. Any further views on that, Professor Allen?
I would agree that it's incredibly important that the workforce is equipped and effective, and the principles set out in the national framework can be met by the workforce, and responding to the wishes and feelings of children and supporting children who are looked after subject to child protection plans. One thing would be also consideration of issues of equality and diversity, and ensuring cultural practices are understood and responded to by the social workers who are working with families, and that's sort of a clear part of it.
Mm-hmm. And there was some criticism. I think the British Association of Social Workers criticised the framework for not referencing a commitment to anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory practice. Is that a concern that you share? Or
I think that point could have been identified and focused on a little more, but many of the points that are made regarding children being raised within their families, children being raised within their communities, the children's welfare is paramount, is part of the broader dialogue regarding a focus on the importance of anti-racist and culturally sensitive practice. If that could have been stated a little more clearly, I think that would have been helpful.
Anything to add, Matthew?
Yeah, I just think overall I think the framework is really helpful. I really like the emphasis on helping families stay together, the importance of family networks. Actually we see the power of family group conferencing, seen the work Family Rights Group have done over recent years, the introduction of lifelong links across the country and the difference that makes, that emphasis on loving relationships for children. I think it's so important, actually, to sort of working with lots of care experience young people, actually see the importance of those relationships, whether it's with birth family, whether it's with a teacher, a foster care, actually building and maintaining those relationships is so fundamental. I think it's really strong. I think what's disappointing, I would say, is you've got a really strong framework and then a scorecard that's been produced alongside it, which kind of just measures what's already been measured, and I think the scorecard and what local authorities are actually then being measured on doesn't reflect the strengths of the framework, so I think there could be further improvement there.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Thank you. And we will come back to your point about the importance of stability and certainty for children. I guess also feeds into why it's so important to improve the retention for social workers, and certainly a complaint I frequently get from my people who are engaging with children's services in my neck of the woods is that they often find they're dealing with a different person almost on every meeting, and it's that issue of trying to build some continuity and build trust which is so important. Flick, can I bring you in?
Okay, so going into a bit more detail about recruitment and retention, because obviously it's really important. I think 83% of councils report that they're having difficulty in recruiting. So what would you suggest to improve the recruitment of social workers? Mary?
Sure. I think Matt touches on it absolutely perfectly around what people come into the profession to do. So sort of harnessing that, but also why people leave, which is that the culture and the conditions in which they work don't enable them to do the work with children and families that they started or wanted to come in to do. So I think we've done a lot of work around attraction, prior to recruitment. In Frontline we have 10 applicants to each of our one places on the programme. I think this year it's 14 applicants. Okay. So something about harnessing that kind of the potential and the opportunity and the energy behind what a great social worker, the power a great social worker can have on the lives of children and families. So I think a national campaign, I know this has been raised on multiple occasions previously, but my view is that social work is such a private endeavour. It happens behind closed doors. The only time we hear about it, and probably rightly in some cases because it's private, is when something goes wrong. So compared to teaching, where we all have contact with education and teachers, and or other more generic council offers that get a lot of sort of attention, notice because the whole public's behind them, the need to focus a little bit on social work and the whys and the hows and the successes, I think would mean that you might be able to tap into a whole group of young people and those leaving from different careers who actually are our larger of those applicants for the Frontline programme. We have more from career changes than we do from new graduates. So I think there's a wider market, and something to attract them would be brilliant.
Tim Lawton and I worked on the future of, I think you may have read it, nearly 20 years ago now. It's just shocking. And one of the things we suggested there was, a television programme or something like that, which would really show how it works. But
I met Tim and Hackney at the time to discuss that very project. So
actually, some of those our recommendations have been adopted, which has been really good. I've been very excited about that because he made me write it and everything. So I had to do all hard work. So this early careers framework which is coming into place,
yes.
Do you think that's going to help with retention?
I think possibly, exactly as Lucille said, that first 5 years is something about knowing the trajectory of what's on offer for the first 5 years of social workers' careers. We generally see, I think we've got 83% of people who've completed post program are still in practice. So I think the it's back to the implementation. If it's done well, I think it could absolutely make a real difference, and I really welcome again that structure and focus for new starters in the profession. It's not an easy profession to navigate. It's not just the work; it's the culture and local authorities which make it really, really challenging. So hopefully that will send a signal about the support that people will gather across the first 5 years of their careers.
And one of the recommendations that we did that, nearly 20 years ago was to say that there should be a career pathway for people to stay on the front line as opposed to go into management, which is the only way they were going to get promoted or get more money.
Exactly.
Is that still the case?
It is absolutely still the case that's not. Again, I think I'm going to say the word leadership 200 times in this conversation, but essentially a strong leader will recognise that and does, and I know lots of local authorities where there are opportunities to become a consultant social worker, so you're kind of the guide and the steerer to those less experienced, so that you can maintain that experience and knowledge in practice rather than, not every great social worker is a great manager, is the upshot. So multiple paths would be ideal.
Yeah, and as far as pay goes as well, is that an issue? Because they are saying that they haven't had the pay growth.
Well, I mean, funding full stop is challenging, as everyone, I'm sure you've heard in lots of these sessions previously. I mean, I think that, yes, but again, the leaders that recognise the importance of that will make the pay commensurate. We as part of the Frontline programme, the structure requires one quite experienced social worker to look after 4 or 5 trainees, for want of a better expression, and those consultants we sort of strongly advise local authorities to pitch alongside a team manager salary. Very few do. So it is the purse strings will absolutely be dictating some of these decisions.
Okay, and has anybody else got views on how we can improve retention and recruitment?
I think some of what's been shared already is really helpful. I think that sort of public image of what a social worker is, and I think why a national campaign would be really helpful. I think back to my own journey. When I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I didn't have any idea what a social worker was. I just thought they were someone that stole babies. And I remember I had just had the luck of chatting to a family friend who was a social worker and worked with young people in the criminal justice system. I never even knew that was a possibility, and then went that route because I enjoyed doing voluntary youth work at the time. But I mean, that was a lucky conversation. I don't think people really understand social workers' profession, and the media image of it is really just when things go wrong. Yeah. So I think actually anything that can be done, I think, one of the reasons in Coventry we took part in the Kids TV documentary was to promote actually, social work can do some amazing things. And I think actually that inspiring of people that this is a profession that they want to go into, I think anything that can be done around that would be really helpful.
Okay. And continued professional development, I mean, is that easy to access, or is because of the nature of the work and you don't have time to do it, etc.? Is that the same, I mean, like in the teaching profession too? It's quite hard to find the time.
Just to add, in terms of continuing professional development and leadership, just to follow on that the Early Careers Framework offers that in terms of the 5 years, and I agree that that's a really positive thing. Also having specialist teaching on subjects that may be slightly sort of outside child and family social work, and maybe in relation to addictions, mental health, leadership, and understanding of these particular specialist areas. Also developing leadership skills in sort of therapeutic practice, working in terms of trauma. And one of the things also thinking about the early career framework, which I think will be part of the discussion, is how to deliver excellence for children and families in a caseload model that is more manageable than certainly a number of child and family social workers say is now, that it can be extremely challenging to do that.
And also, one of the things they complain about is the number of bureaucracy as well, but how can you actually cut down with that when obviously you have to provide evidence for all sorts of things? Is there any look, has anyone looked at how to improve that side of it?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting innovation going on in the sector. We're definitely, we've been exploring actually the use of AI recently with some of that in Coventry, and that's one of the things that we're starting to pilot, to, do smart things like take case notes and put them into chronologies, automatic some of that, to try and reduce some of that that bureaucracy. I think that, ultimately we want our social workers to be spending as much time as possible with children and families, so actually that's always what we're working on. I think there's better systems than there were sort of 5-10 years ago, and it is improving, I think, but I think there's still a long way to go in some of that. And I think one of the challenges is just around actually, what do you need to do? I often think actually the whole social work system is a very bureaucratic system, and I think actually that's not always right for children and families either, and it's really hard to get that balance because you need the right checks and safeguards. But I often think actually if you're a looked after child and you're sitting at 15 years old in a room of professionals for a looked after review discussing your whole life, that's not a normal childhood experience either. And I think sometimes we put so much bureaucracy on, well, why hasn't this child had their annual health assessment? Well, what other 15-year-old has an annual health assessment? They go to the doctors when their foster care takes them. Can we trust our foster carers more to actually make those decisions for children, as opposed to thinking, well, we need to, so I do think we overly regulate the sector sometimes, which makes it quite hard as well.
And I would add that local authorities, I think the whole sway around the suggestion that process and procedure keeps children safe, which I think is hardwired into the system at the moment. We are trying to move to a much more relational, which is, I think, all local authorities, certainly the vast majority, recognise that has the best evidence base for bringing good outcomes for children and families. Yet we're stuck in this machine that, a great example I heard about last week was an initiative around encouraging people to foster or support by taking children for weekends. Weekenders, it's an innovation we're supporting and is being developed and piloted in 2 local authorities. One of them gave me an example of going into an office, having a DBS check on screen, having it printed out, having it faxed, having it printed, then having the physical copy taken to another office where half of the same process happened again. So it's so far away, and the IT systems as well, yes, way better than they were, but compared to what actually in the world, where we are in the world generally, there's a great initiative in North Yorkshire at the moment where AI is being used to identify people of support around a young person, which with previous files wouldn't have been pulled together, sort of a map and a network. But those ideas are few and far between, and actually that sense of a person-centred, multi-agency IT system that police, health could log into and see things. I don't understand why we haven't cracked that nut yet. It just feels so logical and essential. But obviously it's not easy because it hasn't happened and people have been trying, but that would be an amazing step forward to have that.
There's always that block with GDPR, isn't it, which is just ridiculous, really,
exactly.
Because it's blocking a lot of things like that. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. And just wanted to come back to this issue on the funding of the Frontline programme, because obviously that is something which is about developing leadership, developing better culture, and so on and so forth. That obviously is not something which has been made as any great announcement, but I was alerted to it before this meeting.
Yes.
What is it planned to be replaced with something else? Is it planned to be out for commissioning, or is it simply that it's run 2 years and that's it?
Yeah, so I guess I should clarify, it's not the Frontline programme. Obviously the Frontline programme, which brings 500 new graduates into the profession every year, we've got that contract till 2026 with a possible extension for 3 further years, so hopefully that will not be going anywhere. The Pathways programme, so government has funded some form of leadership development since 2015. In 2015 we won the contract to deliver the First Line programme, which was the programme for team managers. We then recognised that next level up, there wasn't anything for them, so we funded through philanthropic income another programme called Headline. We're not very creative with our names, and the idea was that we could test and make a case for the need at that level too. After Headline, the Pathways programme was contract was out for tender. We were in the 2 middle spaces, but the contract included 2 more levels, first level and the next level up. We won that contract with it was a 2 years plus 2 year extension. We had been given all the signals that the extension was going to come through. We were waiting for signing, been waiting for signing since December, and then really, a real surprise, found out a week and a half ago that funding was pulled. You might not even know that yet. We're telling local authorities today. So that's going to not be popular, is my sense, because it's been very welcome. We in First Line, local authorities paid a proportion, because in Frontline we think there's something about skin in the game and that sense of local authorities having some involvement, and local authorities paid about a third of that per participant cost per person. The Pathways programme, DfE were completely clear that had to be fully funded. So local authorities get it entirely for free, and it's available we work with all but 10 local authorities in the country. So
From a local authority perspective, presumably that's quite welcome if the DfE is standing behind it. But
definitely, but I think what's also as welcome is it was a national programme. You know, I've had several managers that report into me, practitioners going on the course, you know, visiting other, the sessions have been really useful. They've had mentoring from senior leaders. They've gone to visit other authorities doing well, thinking about, and I've seen improvements in practice. People are excited about doing the programme. So I think it will be a bit of a kick in the teeth to the profession, because it feels like actually nothing's really given time to happen. You have a 2-year programme that's just starting to embed, and then it's like, oh, we'll try something else.
Certainty in the length of time for these things to bed in, really.
Yeah.
Well, that's something we might want to raise with the department as and when we have the opportunity. So thank you for explaining that and setting it in context as well. I apologise if I inadvertently implied other aspects of what you're doing might be affected. But I'll bring in Nick Fletcher.
Thank you. I want to talk about agency social workers. The rise between 2022 and 2023 was 6.1%. So really, I just want your thoughts on the use of them, and well, what we can do about it, good, bad, indifferent, and why we're ending up in this position. So I'll start with Mary if I can, and then just move down there.
This feels like an age-old problem. I absolutely accept it's got worse, but it feels like we haven't, again, another one of those problems we haven't resolved over many years. I've been working in local authority for 20 years, and there was talk of price cap when I first started. So there's something about, for me, back to the, again, it feels like people don't want to work permanently in local authorities because the culture and the leadership and the structures don't enable them to do the work they want to do. That's a bit simplistic. There will be other reasons as well, financially motivated reasons too. My nervousness about price caps or bans across is that those roles play, are looking after children and families in the system. So, and we have a dearth of we've got newly qualified, but we don't have those experienced people. So I don't have a winning answer on this one, but my nervousness about a price cap or any kind of universal changes is that they may hamstring local authorities more than currently.
The social workers, when they were, is a social worker assigned to a family over a set period of time, and does the use of agencies mean that you could end up with different social workers going to different people?
100%, but again, I've worked in authorities where agency workers are, some local, it'd be entirely down to the how the local authority wanted to set themselves up. So it's back to that leadership point. I have worked in local authorities where fantastic people work through agencies, and they're known and they've stayed with the organisation for 4 years, and everyone bends over backwards to try and keep them, so that there's scenario, right through to I don't like it. Here's my week notice. I'm off. And that, of course, that's the worst of those conditions. But I guess the flip side is they don't get holiday. There's all the kind of commercial interest. They're not part of the workforce. Things may have changed since I worked in local authorities, but when I did, no local authority offered training, so CPD wasn't on offer to agency workers. So there's almost this kind of othering that happens, but the best local authorities will bring the people who are going to stick around for a long time and do great work and include them as part of the workforce, and then try and convince them to join permanently.
You see, it happens in every single industry, that. I mean, it just does. So, but I can understand the difficulties. Art, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think for me, there's obviously a role for agency workers. Like, we've reduced our numbering, obviously, but actually when we've got maternity vacancies, things like that, actually agency workers can come in and fill an important role. I think, to me, two things have significantly changed over the last few years, which is around that. It's firstly, people are going to work for agencies a lot earlier, so often we're getting CVs of agency workers that are basically just newly qualified social workers, and I find that really concerning because they haven't had the time and investment in a local authority with a CPD to get to the level that you need to be to come in, and the expectations on agency workers are quite high because they're paid a premium. They're often coming in to cover work, so they don't have the necessary, we invest in them in training and stuff, but we wouldn't be expecting to treat them like a newly qualified social worker and give them protections that a newly qualified social worker has, so that's concerning. The other thing is the use of project teams, and to me that's become really concerning, where sort of some private companies have hoovered up a sector of the market and you may need a couple of agency workers to cover some roles, but actually all you can get is a project team to come in with management costs, etc. Instead, and you're sort of faced with that dilemma as a local authority. Well, actually we only needed 2 or 3 social workers, but do we need to bring in this project team because that's the only way we can actually get the staff we need to deliver a service to children. And so that's been a fairly new development in the market over the last few years. But I think it all comes back overall to that shortage of social workers in the market, because it's forcing people to make decisions that maybe they're not as comfortable with as local authorities to make sure that families and children are still getting the service they need.
Just to follow on from Matt's point about newly qualified social workers and students going into agency work quite early, and we say to our students, we really recommend that you don't do that you go to a local authority, you complete your assessed and supported year in employment, soon it will be the ECF, and you become part of the workforce, the profession, you have all the rights, you have the training. So I think it would be helpful if we did a campaign about social work recruitment, that we included messages like that around the importance of newly qualified social workers actually coming into local authorities and learning how to be a social worker in practice. And as I say, I hope the ECF builds that strong model where workers will feel happy to do that.
Thank you. Mary, your evidence stated that local authority culture and leadership must be changed in order for government reforms to be effective. What changes would you actually make?
I think the back to that kind of principle around everything being the lack of removing some of the process and bureaucracy and structural kind of old schoolness. But essentially, this leadership, when it's done really well, is very, very relational. And at the moment, what we sometimes see is, you've got those directors or the next level down, practice leaders. The best practice leaders and director combinations that cover between them, understanding the children in their borough or their council or county, what their needs are, those sort of 20 to 30, whichever number it is, but those really high-risk kids, keep close to them, make sure the workers are understanding what's going on with those families. Directors I'm most impressed by still see families, still work with families. They mentor and model social workers, they're close to the work. And at the same time, someone who's sitting at the table alongside the chief exec and able to petition for the voices of children to be on par with the voices of those needing their bins collected. So the very structure of local authorities can sometimes get in the way of what the director will be holding as absolutely dear and central and their primary purpose. So I know there's been, again, lots of work done around what sort of different system might be in place. I haven't got an answer, but I know trust system has worked really effectively sometimes and not so effectively other times. So but there's something about that that again, back to people don't vote for a great child protection service. They vote for good services across a local authority. So there's something about the structure getting in the way of that culture. And back to the incentives we heard about in the previous session, is and I know that social workers get a bad rap. We do a lot of our workers to try and stop them getting that bad rap. And exactly as both Lucille and Matt have said, people go into the profession to make a difference. They will only not be working in that way because in the local authority, how many times you have to visit a child in X date, this form has to be, all of that, that will be the thing that gets in the way of them doing the work they want to do. And
it's relational, goes all the way up. And it is relational. Obviously, if you've got a child in front of you, it's hugely. I mean, you talked about the other panel saying when they get to 18, then they're just. I mean, it'd break your heart. I mean, I'm not a foster, but I couldn't just say, right, 18, you're gone. I just couldn't do it. I know I couldn't. No. So I'd have to be careful taking one on, because I know this is a lifetime commitment, just like it is with your own children. It's not up until they're 18, it's lifetime. Yeah. And a 25 and still causing me grief. But there's a nature of it's. We've created this tick box exercise and all these rules and regulations because there's bad actors in there as well, isn't there? And there is poor social workers and there is difficult children. And if you get both together and there's not a tick box exercise being done, then somebody's job's on the line and somebody's. And so it is difficult because it's human beings. I'm not ticking a box for a TV being made. No. I'm ticking a box for a child, aren't I?
I completely agree, and I think it's a really fine line, and I think excellent practitioners walk that line very well, because and that's what we should be, working towards, is developing those excellent practitioners across their careers and teaching them the things that will enable them to focus on that, rather than and talking to their manager when they're feeling stressed about missing their timelines, and the manager then agreeing what the next steps. It's got to be more around, and that's what I think Stable Homes Level, the care review more specifically, describes that well.
I think it takes brave leadership as well. I think it takes leadership that goes, actually, what's important to this child over actually what is the right box to tick. And there's times where we have to make decisions. Adoption is a really good example. You can speed up your adoption timescales by making sure that you only have children being adopted that are easy to adopt. But actually, I'm really ambitious that actually if a child should be adopted, that's the right thing. And if that means our average length of adoption goes up because actually we've got some complex children that should be adopted, but actually that's the right thing for them, then that's more important than what our scorecard reads for adoption timescales. And I think there's so many examples across the system where actually you have to make decisions that actually might not hit a box, but actually is the right thing for that child. And I think leaders have to really demonstrate that. And I think as May said, that builds a culture where social workers feel more confident that actually they can make decisions that are in the best interest for children. And you sometimes have to do that. You have to sometimes say, actually, how are we going to find the right solution for this child? Sometimes you're looking at kinship carers as another good example where actually the fostering regulations, they wouldn't meet, and that puts you in a difficult example. So we can't regulate this placement even though these people really care for this child. So how are we going to do that in a system that doesn't necessarily allow us to? So there's some real complexities. But I think fundamentally as leaders we have to hold on to, well, actually how are we making sure that this is the best outcome for this child? And then we have to make sure we find a way to make that work, as opposed to just saying, well, actually no, the system doesn't allow this to do that, so we're going to do something different for the child that might not be what's best for them, because then we hit all the boxes that we're meant to hit.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
Just to add around leadership and not getting into the sort of focus on box ticking. Leadership also that can tolerate social workers not always getting it quite right, that there can be some mistakes, and that the social worker can approach a senior leader, a practice leader in their borough, and say, I did this is why I did it. And that sort of learning approach that is nurtured and welcomed, because then social workers feel, I want to stay here because I've got these leaders around me who are experts and who will listen when I'm not sure or I don't get it quite right. And that's what social workers tell me in the contact that I have with them.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the fostering network has told us in evidence that there are difficulties often in relationships between foster carers and social workers. And a cohort of foster workers report that they feel undervalued. I can tell that's already something that you're aware of, but I'm wondering how you feel it can be addressed. And I'd add to that the distinction maybe between social workers working with agency foster parents and those that the authority that themselves recruit in-house. So start with you, Mary.
Okay. I recognise that. I think, again, it's born out of social workers not being able to necessarily do the job they want and some of that friction, but I also think it goes wider than foster carers. I think there are tensions across many disciplines. Social workers sort of feel very clearly that they have that young person's, they have that young person's interest at heart, and that they work closely with them, and that they're theirs. And yet a teacher might feel quite differently about what they're seeing in the classroom, and foster carers have a different perspective, which I think comes back to, I guess, again, the previous session, all the panellists were talking about, let's forget about us as a system and think about those people in the middle of it, and that they all, every single young person, full stop, particularly those in care or who've had, mental health and not great experiences, need someone around them. They need someone, ideally more than one, but one person around them. So I think and I think that, again, the system doesn't enable that to be. So if it's supporting the foster care, and I think the example that was given around the DBS being passed off and off, and the examples given at the previous session around, family members or kinship carers feeling like they need to badger local authorities for any support, and that all feeds into that fractious kind of relationship. But I think underpinning all of that is a lack of understanding across from each other's perspectives. So it's back to that kind of, I know it sounds a bit, there must be structure to put around it, but that relational element of understanding different perspectives and how I can do what supports you and how you, and we don't have those conversations because the whole system is built up to be in silos.
Do you think there's an issue of process? There's so many process requirements. Every time something goes wrong, as Lucille touched upon, someone, usually in this building, says, there must be a new set of forms we have to fill in, a new set of checks we have to do. So it all becomes about fulfilling the process rather than having the time to talk about the actual emotional and relationship issues.
I absolutely agree. And that back to this Now Foster initiative, which is supporting local authorities to identify new foster carers, that they almost do the processy stuff by stealth. You know, they build the relationship first. They don't do any box ticking stuff in that first conversation. They're doing it in a way where they're having, and they're getting great results in terms of they're finding not huge numbers of people, but who they're finding they're taking through. But they're having to almost go around the local authority because the process is what guides and leads things, and that's just one very sort of specific example.
Yeah, I think some of what's been picked up on already is really key. I think some of those things around relationships are key. I think for foster carers, some of the things are similar to social workers in terms of having the sort of autonomy, time and space, freedom to make the right decisions for a child. I think foster carers can get very frustrated that they're having to chase social workers to make simple decisions for children. So I think actually empowering foster carers to make some of those decisions. But I think what Mary spoke about too, those relationships are key, and the fact that people do fulfil slightly different roles, and that can sometimes lead to conflict. Actually, a children's social worker is there primarily to focus on the child. That means working with the foster carer, but sometimes, I think back to days I was a social worker, and sometimes I'd have a young person telling me how unhappy they were in their foster placements, and as a social worker you have to manage those dynamics and sometimes have difficult conversations. So a good social worker will be able to manage those relationships, but there is always going to be some challenge in that. And I think where it's really difficult is where you have change after social work. I think when you've got that stability of the social worker, it doesn't matter if there's a bit of conflict because you work that through with the foster carer and the child, and you deal with that just like any other family situation, relationship would. I think what's hard is if you have a social worker goes in, has a difficult conversation, and the next week a different social worker comes along, because I think that's where foster carers get really frustrated, because they're like, I'm here every day with this child, I've got a different person coming in every week telling me something different. And so I think that if we can stabilise the social work workforce, I think that would deal with a lot of the challenges between social work and foster carers.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Just to add, in terms of changes of social workers, that can be a huge challenge for foster carers, as Matt said. And also there can be differences around views around care planning. So the foster carer may feel it's better if the child or young person attends a certain activity or is engaged in a sort of a certain way, and there can be differences around that. And yes, there are many process requirements in fostering, and foster carers can feel sometimes that the processes are taking precedent over the work they're doing with the child. And so, we would hope that foster carers do feel valued, can feel valued for the excellent work that they do, and that they get the support to attend the fostering panel when the renewal comes up, so that they're able to talk about their successes and the things that have gone well, and that the social worker is alongside them doing that and is a consistent figure in their life.
And just to build on that, some of the evidence we've had have said that working with social workers has made people feel stigmatised rather than being helped and supported. But also, NSPCC said social workers sometimes feel that they're only able to act when a situation has become chronic, rather than being able to help and provide assistance earlier. And I wonder whether that's, again, is that due to resource, that they can only act when it becomes chronic because they're chasing their own tail, or is, again, that an issue between the relationship between carers and social workers? To start with you, Lucille.
In terms of foster carers, are you referring to, or working with families?
Yeah, well, I mean, foster carers is the specific focus, but, you know, the reflections are helpful.
So foster carers, in my experience, in the area I'm part of a fostering panel, do get really good support at an early stage and have really strong relationships with the local authorities that they're working with, and there is a reasonably stable workforce, and that actually works really well, including for kinship foster carers, connected persons foster carers who are grandparents maybe, as a previous colleague referred to, and that there's understanding around that process. But perhaps it isn't like that everywhere, that foster carers can feel they're not getting early enough support to help them. And also in terms of more...
I think it's where asking for support makes social workers or the system feel not that someone needs some support, but if they're asking for support, there's a problem.
Yes. And
something's going wrong.
In my experience, just in the work that I've done and I'm involved in as a fostering panel member, that hasn't been my experience. The foster carers respond well to and are able to express their needs. There's quite a partnership approach, but there are challenges in the system that a foster carer asking for help, or a connected person's kinship foster carer asking for help, shouldn't be seen as you're not coping, we need to do something drastic to change that. So I can appreciate there can be some sort of worries about that, especially if a child has made an allegation, and that can make foster carers very, very nervous about, what has happened, and asking for help in these circumstances. And again, as Matt said, if there's a turnover of social workers, that exacerbates the problem. A stable workforce really does centre the system, and carers and social workers, parents just feel, more secure within that.
Matt or Mary, got anything sort of absolutely critical to add to that, or shall we move on? Anything to add? No?
I'm happy to.
Mary, no, thank you.
Caroline, on reunification.
Thank you, Chair. Last series of questions, I think, and it's around the very important challenge of reunification, which is obviously one of the most important ambitions here. Is the government doing enough to reunify children with their birth families?
I don't think they are, no. I think obviously the recent report from the NSBC for Action for Children focused on the fact that only about 20% of authorities have separate reunification teams. I think when you look at how many failings there are within the care system, to not be visiting regularly whether actually the situation has changed for a family and whether we can support children to return to their family is a real failure of the whole system.
So do you think the government should direct local authorities to establish these discrete and separate teams then? Is that the failing you're describing?
To me, the government should direct local authorities to there to be an emphasis on reunification and measure how local authorities are doing around that, and potentially, I think, how local authorities do that, whether it's a separate team or whether they put resource within teams to do that. I think obviously there's different models, and you could argue different success. One of the things that the report that's been done argues for is to more research in that area, because as only a small number of local authorities are doing that work, actually there hasn't been the level of research to see, well, what does work? Does a separate reunification team work well better than local authorities in practice?
Is the government's role there enabling the sharing of good practice?
Yes, I think there's a real role to be done for the government in sharing good practice and putting an emphasis on reunification as well. The Children Act talks about the importance of family, and children should be with their families wherever possible, but I think once the children are in the care system, I think historically too often it's been a bit of a tick box exercise. You have a looked after children's review and the care plan is to remain in care. Are people really visiting? But we know that actually, especially by the time a care experience young person is 25, for 80% their primary source of support is their birth family. So you think, well, why are we not thinking differently at an earlier stage? And I think
what would the emphasis look like, if not then a sort of tick box in terms of achieving a certain level of reunification? How else might an emphasis manifest itself?
I mean, to me, is the need to actually revisit situations and reassess family members, and not think because a situation looks like this once, then it's always there. So actually, where the go back, and that doesn't mean do a full assessment, but actually properly go, actually, have we spoken to family members? Has their situation changed? Have we looked at that situation from where it was previously? You know, there's plenty of situations where older children have been removed and parents now have younger children in their care, but actually people haven't gone back and think, wait a minute, now they're caring for younger children now, can they there care for their older children?
The local authority doesn't have the autonomy to act in that way then? You're saying national government would need to mandate this change in procedure?
Local authorities do have the autonomy to do that, and I think so. We've done a lot of that in Coventry and been quite successful, but I think actually that's taken us sort of doing it and changing the approach. I think it takes a bit of a push, I think, in terms of policy, steer, and ultimately, and it's, you know, we've done it for an investor save type argument, but actually does it need a bit of a kickstart almost to get it going in terms of actually, you know, like government have released funding for things like befriending and mentoring programs or something. Actually, is there something about actually we're going to really push this in 20 authorities to see the impact of this and put a bit of fund money in to start that process and see whether it actually the success that some authorities have can be replicated. Yeah, to develop that evidence base. And I think, you know, in the climate, it's hard for authorities to go, actually, we're going to invest a bit because we think we can have results. So it probably does need that sort of push.
I absolutely agree. I think there's something about in any, like what we're talking about is a giant, I mean, liner is the overused analogy, but we're trying to sort of really change the way a whole system that's very kind of complex and lots of moving parts to move, so think differently. So I think it's back to when you're changing a culture, it's got to be an element of carrot and stick, doesn't it? I think there's got to be, you don't want to go to, it's a nuanced kind of balance, but I think the incentives and then examples of where it's worked more effectively and what went wrong and what got in the way. Regional variances are really relevant here. London has better, lower rates of children in care per 10,000 than other parts of the country. So I think there's more could be done, but I think it is absolutely within the local authority's gift, as is a lot of this stuff. I think what I'm sure you've heard in lots of previous sessions is that the local authorities don't feel like they have any wiggle room with budgets at the moment. It's really stripped bare, so that will absolutely be making it more
Their
complicated.
constraint is financial rather than policy, rather than direction.
Yeah, exactly.
And shaping the syllabus.
I think so. Except financial and that sort of sense of this is how we've done it. It makes me nervous to think about taking that away. You know, there's some things around the cultural shift that, you know, the general sense will be that it will be unsafe to do lots of stuff that it really wouldn't be unsafe to do. So there's that kind of that sense.
I think the partnership stuff is key to that as well.
Agreed.
When we started our reunification journey in Coventry, actually one of the real challenges was around working with police, health colleagues, but police in particular, around some of these young people. They're young people that have maybe been moved out of area to be in expensive residential placements. Police were quite nervous about them coming back into the city. Well, what if they exploit? What if there's missing episodes? And so actually it really took a bit of a partnership approach. And so I think actually that sort of understanding being across, not just in children's services, but across the public sector. Actually, stable homes built on love. We want children to be with their families wherever possible, and that's a sort of partnership approach, I think, is quite key as well.
Lucille, same question.
I would agree that it is really important to develop the evidence base and listen to the learning that Matt has talked about around partnership working, and also thinking about the child, young person, their legal status, their networks, how it might feel to them that this is being considered or approached. And I think lots of work is needed, as you have done, Matt, to inform local authorities about how to do that, how to approach it. As Mary said, I'm sure they'd be quite nervous about going into something without really exploring each step that they have to go through. Thank you.
I was going to next, that was obviously the role of national government, and we moved to local government. The specific role of the social worker when it comes to this very important time, or the social work team, how do you see that playing out in practice, particularly in the context where you're describing a sort of not the most stable workforce around, obviously, these very key moments? What's the role for the social worker or team?
I think the role of the social working team is crucial. Interestingly, since we've had a reunification project, we've had like no turnover of staff in that team, which I think shows something about the fact that that's a project where an area people want to work and they're being allowed to do the work. You know, they've got quite small protected caseloads. They're given the time and space to really work with those families. It's not just social workers in that team. We have a mix of professionals in that team, and I think that's quite important as well, that there's people with different skill sets. We've got some therapeutic practitioners within that team as well. One of the big things that we say about our reunification project is actually this team is with you for as long as you need it, and I think that's really important. You know, these are children that ultimately, if they hadn't gone back to their parents' care, would have been paying for placements till they were 18, and they'd have been supported as care leavers to 25. So actually, you know, these families and these children both need to learn to trust one another again, but also trust the local of us as children's services. So we're really clear that actually we'll be with you for as long as it takes, and you know that means for some of those families, for our reunification project, we've now stepped back. With care orders revoked, they've got no involvement. Some of them went back, have had that for a period of time, and then phoned up and said, "Oh, can I have a bit of support again?" And we're like, "Yes, the door's always open. We're here when you need it." And some of them have continued to have very intense support throughout to make that work. But for me, that it's led by them. But I think for the practitioners, they all love being part of it because they feel that they can see the difference they're making. They've been in court celebrating care orders being revoked and then going out for celebratory meals with the families and actually seeing the difference that makes. They're doing the social work that they got into the profession to do. And so I think it's just fascinating that the retention's been really high in that area, and I think it does show actually when social workers are doing what they're passionate about, it really helps you to retain good people.
Fantastic, that's so good to hear. One final question for all the panel. The challenges, though, within that reunification process and how they can be mitigated. Mary?
I think the multi-agency point is a massively important one. And I'm thinking back to that, and obviously I think the idea that people get to do, you know, that sort of local authority creating the conditions that they can practice in a way that's going to both bring about change and feel satisfying. That wider piece around multi-agency, I guess I can think of just off the top of my head, you know, West London's own Shift, Football Beyond Borders, and that reunification team sort of offering that lifelong support and being wraparound. And that funding probably comes from 4 different government departments, and you know, DfE, Ministry of Justice, and I think there's something on a broader level about that kind of focus on children specifically, from all the different lenses that which children are sort of supported through, which I think you're kind of describing in a mini version in the reunification team. That would be an absolute game changer, I'm sure.
That's it, Matt.
I think for me it is that we're there for as long as it takes, and actually we accepting that it's not a linear process. Like for all the families that we've seen go through reunification, there's been ups and downs, there's been blips, there's been things where stuff goes wrong. And I remember powerfully examples where families on reunification, things didn't go as well as we wanted at times. And I got nervous as a manager thinking, oh, should we pull the plug on this or not? And actually it took a couple of brave practitioners to go, well, what did you expect? These families have always failed. Like they're expecting to fail, and they're expecting us to say they failed. So we're going to have to work differently. We're going to have to trust them. We're going to have to give them second, third chances with the safeguards around that. And I think actually accepting that actually, you know, people make mistakes in life, and it's how we support them through those mistakes and work with them on that journey is really important.
Period of grace.
Yeah,
time, period of grace. And Lucille, last word.
Thank you. Just in terms of following on, it's a focus on creative approaches to working with children and families, and to have families, children and young people themselves designing how the system works best for them, thinking about their family culture, their identity, and having this approach that Matt has talked about, that the social workers stay with it. And it shows that social workers want to be part of positive change for children, and to stay with even when things are getting difficult, that we don't actually give up. And that's what social work is all about, really.
Very good. A positive note on which to finish the session. Thank you very much for all the evidence from all of you.
Thank you.
Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.